The rhythmic thud of Samuel Hayes's axe echoed through the Montana wilderness, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Each swing split the crisp morning air along with the pine timber, sending wood chips flying in golden arcs that caught the early sunlight filtering through the dense canopy above. Sweat beaded on his weathered forehead, despite the autumn chill, and his calloused hands gripped the worn wooden handle with practiced precision. Samuel paused, wiping his brow with the back of his flannel sleeve, and surveyed his work. 3 massive pines lay felled around him, their fresh-cut scent mixing with the earthy smell of damp soil and fallen leaves. At 42, he had been working these woods for nearly 8 years, ever since he'd fled the memories that haunted every corner of his former life in Minnesota. The silence that followed the cessation of his chopping felt oppressive. It always did. In the quiet moments, his mind wandered to places he'd rather it didn't go. To Mary's gentle laugh, to little Thomas taking his first steps, to the fever that had claimed them both in a matter of days. He shook his head violently, as if the motion could dislodge the thoughts, and reached for his axe again. His cabin sat in a clearing about a quarter-mile from where he worked, smoke rising lazily from its stone chimney. It was a modest structure he'd built with his own hands, solid logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone foundation that would outlast him, and a roof that had weathered 3 harsh Montana winters without leaking. Inside, it was Spartan. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, though he'd never had a visitor to occupy the second, shelves lined with canned goods, and Mary's Bible gathering dust on the mantelpiece. The nearest settlement, Bear Creek, lay 12 miles to the east, but Samuel rarely ventured there except for essential supplies. The townspeople knew him as the quiet Irishman who paid his bills and kept to himself. They whispered sometimes about his past, but he'd never given them enough information to satisfy their curiosity, and eventually they'd stopped trying. As the day wore on, Samuel loaded his wagon with the timber he'd prepared. The wood would be hauled to Bear Creek tomorrow, where it would help build homes for families arriving on the frontier. There was bitter irony in it, a man who'd lost his family helping others build theirs, but it was honest work, and it kept his hands busy. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when Samuel decided to check his trap lines. He'd set several rabbit snares along the creek that meandered through a valley about 2 miles from his cabin. The walk would do him good, and fresh meat was always welcome as winter approached. The path to the creek wound through stands of aspen whose leaves had turned brilliant gold, creating a natural cathedral of color overhead. Samuel's boots crunched softly on the carpet of fallen leaves as he made his way down the gentle slope. The sound of running water grew louder as he approached, and he could hear the distinctive call of a red-winged blackbird somewhere in the reeds. He checked the first 2 snares, empty but undisturbed, good signs that the rabbits were still using this route. The third trap, set near a fallen log where he'd noticed tracks, held a fat cottontail. Samuel reset the snare and moved on to the 4th location, near a bend in the creek where the water had carved out a small pool. It was there that he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it over the babbling of the water. A low moan, distinctly human, coming from somewhere downstream. Samuel froze, his hand instinctively moving to the knife on his belt. In 8 years of solitude he'd encountered bears, mountain lions, and the occasional wolf, but never another person this far from any trail. The sound came again, weaker this time, and Samuel's caution gave way to concern. Someone was hurt, and badly from the sound of it. He made his way carefully along the creek bank, pushing through stands of willows and stepping over moss-covered rocks. What he found made him stop in his tracks. Chapter 2. An Unexpected Burden. A young Native American woman lay crumpled at the base of a rocky outcropping, her dark hair spilled across the gray stones like spilled ink. Her buckskin dress was torn and stained with blood, and one leg was bent at an unnatural angle. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and labored, her bronze skin pale with shock and pain. Samuel's first instinct was to back away. The tensions between the white settlers and the local Sioux tribes had been escalating for months. Just last week, he'd heard talk in Bear Creek about cattle being stolen and fences being cut. The territorial governor had even issued warnings about traveling alone in certain areas. Finding an injured Sioux woman was the kind of situation that could get a man killed, no matter what his intentions. But as he stood there, frozen by indecision, the woman's eyes fluttered open. They were dark brown, almost black, and filled with pain and fear. When she saw him, she tried to push herself up, crying out as the movement sent agony shooting through her injured leg. She spoke rapidly in her native language, words that Samuel couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear enough. She was asking for help. "Easy there," Samuel said softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're hurt pretty bad." The woman's eyes darted around frantically, taking in her surroundings and the white man standing over her. She tried again to move, and again cried out in pain. Tears of frustration and agony ran down her cheeks as she fell back against the rocks. Samuel knelt down carefully, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. Up close he could see she was young, probably no more than 20, with delicate features and intelligent eyes. The gash on her forehead was deep, but had stopped bleeding, and her leg was definitely broken. Without medical attention, she would die here by the creek, alone and in pain. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, though he wasn't sure she understood English. "My name is Samuel." The woman studied his face for a long moment, perhaps trying to judge his intentions. When he made no aggressive moves, she spoke again, this time more slowly. The words were still in Lakota, but her tone was different, not demanding help but asking for it. Samuel looked around at the rocky outcropping above them. The woman had obviously fallen, probably while gathering something. He could see scattered roots and herbs around her, suggesting she'd been collecting medicine or food when the accident occurred. The fall couldn't have happened too long ago, or she would have succumbed to her injuries already. "I'm going to help you," Samuel said, more to himself than to her. "God help me, but I can't just leave you here to die." He stood and quickly surveyed the situation. The woman was too injured to walk, and the climb back up to the main trail would be impossible for her even with help. He would have to carry her, but first he needed to stabilize her leg. Samuel had some experience with injuries from his logging work. Men were always getting hurt in the woods, and the nearest doctor was often days away. Using his knife, he cut branches from a nearby willow and tore strips from his own shirt to create a makeshift splint. The woman watched him work, her dark eyes tracking his movements with a mixture of wariness and hope. When he approached her injured leg, she tensed, but she didn't try to stop him. "This is going to hurt," Samuel warned, though he doubted she understood the words. She seemed to grasp his meaning, though, and bit down on a leather strap from her dress as he carefully straightened and splinted her leg. She endured the pain with remarkable stoicism, only a slight tightening around her eyes betraying her agony. When Samuel finished with the splint, she spoke again, and this time he caught what sounded like a word of thanks. The hardest part was yet to come. Samuel was a big man, strong from years of logging, but carrying an injured person over rough terrain was challenging under the best circumstances. He carefully lifted the woman in his arms, surprised by how light she was despite her height. She was probably undernourished, he realized, like many of her people as white settlement encroached on their traditional hunting grounds. The journey back to his cabin took twice as long as usual. Samuel had to stop frequently to rest and to check on his patient, who drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time she woke, her eyes found his face, and he tried to offer what reassurance he could through expression and tone, since words seemed useless between them. By the time they reached his cabin, the sun had set and the first stars were appearing in the clear Montana sky. Samuel's arms ached, and sweat had soaked through his clothes despite the cool evening air, but they had made it. As he carried the woman across the threshold of his cabin, Samuel couldn't help but think about what he was doing. He was taking an enormous risk, harboring an injured Sioux woman in his home. If her people came looking for her, they might assume the worst. If the townspeople found out, they would certainly assume the worst. Either way, Samuel Hayes, who had sought nothing but solitude for 8 years, was about to find his quiet life irrevocably changed. Chapter 3. Breaking Barriers. The woman had been unconscious for most of the night, her breathing steady but shallow as Samuel kept vigil beside his bed where he'd placed her. He had made himself a makeshift sleeping area on the floor near the fireplace, close enough to tend to her if needed, but far enough to give her space. Every few hours he checked her pulse and dabbed cool water on her forehead to bring down the fever that had developed. When dawn broke through the cabin's single window, painting everything in soft golden light, her eyes finally opened. For a moment she seemed disoriented, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings, the rough-hewn log walls, the simple furniture, the smell of wood smoke and coffee. Then her gaze found Samuel, who was stirring a pot of oatmeal over the fire. "You're awake," he said softly, setting down his wooden spoon. "How are you feeling?" She tried to sit up, wincing as pain shot through her leg. Samuel quickly moved to help her, propping pillows behind her back. She spoke in Lakota, her voice hoarse but stronger than the day before. Though he couldn't understand the words, her tone seemed to convey gratitude, mixed with wariness. "I don't understand," Samuel admitted, pointing to himself. "Samuel," he said clearly, then pointed to her with a questioning expression. She studied his face for a moment, perhaps deciding whether to trust him with something as personal as her name. Finally, she touched her chest and spoke slowly. "Ayanna." "Ayanna," Samuel repeated, and was rewarded with a small nod. The name sounded like music, compared to the harsh consonants he was used to hearing in English and Irish. "It's a beautiful name." Though she didn't understand his words, something in his tone must have conveyed the compliment because her expression softened slightly. Samuel ladled some oatmeal into a bowl and approached the bed carefully, showing her the food before offering it to her. Ayanna's stomach growled audibly, betraying her hunger despite her obvious discomfort with the situation. She accepted the bowl with both hands, a gesture that Samuel recognized as respectful, and ate slowly. The oatmeal was plain. Samuel wasn't much of a cook, but she finished every bit. Over the next few hours, they began the delicate process of communication. Samuel pointed to objects around the cabin and said their names in English, while Ayanna responded with the Lakota words. Water became Emnai, fire became Pita, and bread became Aguyapi. Samuel found himself genuinely enjoying the exchange, his mind working in ways it hadn't for years. Ayanna proved to be an intelligent teacher, patient with his pronunciation, and quick to understand his attempts at her language. When he brought her water and said Emni, she smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and corrected his pronunciation with gentle repetition. By afternoon, they had established a basic vocabulary and a rhythm of interaction. Samuel learned that Ayanna was indeed gathering medicine when she fell, and that she was worried about her grandmother, who was expecting the healing herbs she'd been collecting. Through gestures and the few words they now shared, she managed to convey that her people would be looking for her soon. This revelation sent a chill down Samuel's spine. He'd been so focused on helping her that he hadn't fully considered the consequences. If her tribe found her here, they might assume he had kidnapped or harmed her. The fact that she was injured might only make things worse, regardless of the truth. "How long before they come looking?" Samuel asked. Though he wasn't sure she understood the question, Ayanna seemed to grasp his meaning, holding up 2 fingers, then pointing to the sun and making a circular motion. 2 days, perhaps, or 2 sunrises. Either way, it wasn't much time. Samuel spent the rest of the day in a state of nervous energy, checking and rechecking his rifle, making sure his cabin was secure, and trying to figure out what he would say if armed Sioux warriors appeared at his door. But as he watched Ayanna gradually relaxing in his presence, speaking more freely and even laughing softly at his mispronunciations, he realized that his biggest concern wasn't his own safety. It was making sure she didn't get hurt in whatever confrontation might come. That evening, as Samuel prepared a simple dinner of salt pork and beans, Ayanna surprised him by speaking in halting English. "You, good man, why you help Ayanna?" Samuel paused in his cooking, considering the question. Why had he helped her? The practical answer was that he couldn't leave an injured person to die. But there was more to it than that. Something about her situation had reminded him of his own helplessness when Mary and Thomas were dying, when all his strength and determination couldn't save the people he loved most. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally, and because he struggled with how to explain it, because nobody should die alone. Ayanna studied his face intently, as if trying to read the deeper meaning in his words. Finally, she nodded slowly. "You have sadness, like Ayanna." Her perceptiveness caught him off guard. Samuel had thought he'd hidden his grief well over the years, but apparently it was more visible than he'd realized, at least to someone who understood pain. "Yes," he admitted quietly, "I have sadness." They ate their dinner in companionable silence, 2 wounded souls finding unexpected comfort in each other's presence. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both that winter was approaching fast. Chapter 4. Shadows on the Horizon. The second day of Ayanna's recovery brought both progress and growing tension. Her fever had broken completely, and she was able to sit up for longer periods without dizzy spells. The makeshift splint Samuel had fashioned was holding well, and though her leg was far from healed, the bone seemed to be setting properly. She was even able to take a few tentative steps with his help, though the pain was still considerable. Their communication had improved dramatically as well. Ayana had a natural gift for languages, and Samuel discovered that his Irish-accented English was actually easier for her to understand than the clipped tones of other whites she'd encountered. They could now hold simple conversations, mixing English and Lakota words with gestures to bridge the gaps in understanding. "My grandmother, she teaches me white man's words," Ayana explained as they shared breakfast. "She says, understanding brings peace, maybe." "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," Samuel replied, refilling her coffee cup. He'd been surprised to discover that Ayana enjoyed coffee, though she preferred it much weaker than his usual bitter brew. "She is medicine woman. Very old, very respected." Ayana searched for the right word. People come from far places for her healing. Samuel understood why Ayana had been gathering herbs. If her grandmother was a medicine woman, then Ayana was likely training to follow in her footsteps. The fall that had injured her had probably interrupted something important, perhaps a seasonal gathering of specific plants that wouldn't be available much longer. "She will be worried about you," Samuel observed. Ayana nodded gravely. "Yes, and my brother. He will be angry. He says white men cannot be trusted, that they bring only death and sorrow to our people." The weight of her words settled over Samuel like a heavy blanket. He knew the history, had heard the stories filtering through Bear Creek about broken treaties, stolen land, and violence on both sides. Ayana's brother had good reason for his mistrust, and Samuel's act of kindness might be seen as something much more sinister. "What's your brother's name?" Samuel asked. "Mato," Ayana replied. "It means bear in your language. He is fierce warrior, protective of family." Samuel could imagine a fierce warrior brother, probably with equally fierce friends, all armed and convinced that something terrible had happened to their missing family member. The image wasn't comforting. As the day progressed, Samuel found himself glancing out the windows more frequently, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Ayana noticed his nervousness and tried to reassure him. "Maybe they not find us," she said hopefully. "This place very hidden." But even as she spoke, they both knew it was unlikely. Native trackers were legendary for their skills, and Samuel's wagon tracks from recent trips to Bear Creek would leave a clear trail for anyone who knew how to read sign. It wasn't a matter of if Ayana's people would find them, but when. Around midday, Samuel was splitting kindling outside the cabin when he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. It was distant but unmistakable, the howl of a wolf. But Samuel had lived in these woods long enough to know the difference between a real wolf and a human imitation. This was a signal, and it was answered by another call from a different direction, then another. Ayana heard it too. Samuel saw her stiffen through the window, her face pale with worry. When he came back inside, she was struggling to stand despite the pain in her leg. "They come," she said simply. "My people. They come now." Samuel felt his heart hammering against his ribs, but he forced himself to stay calm. "How many?" Ayana listened to the calls, which were getting closer and more frequent. "Maybe 6, 7 warriors. They spread out, surround this place." Samuel nodded grimly. He'd expected this moment, but knowing it was coming didn't make it any less terrifying. 7 armed warriors against 1 man was not good odds, especially when that man was trying to protect the very person they were looking for. "Ayana," he said urgently, "you need to call out to them, let them know you're safe, that I haven't hurt you." She was already moving toward the door, hobbling on her injured leg. "Yes, but Samuel, they may not listen at first. They will be very angry, very afraid for Ayana." Samuel helped her to the door, then stepped back to give her space. His rifle was loaded and propped against the wall nearby, but he prayed he wouldn't need to use it. If shooting started, someone was going to die, and he had no illusions about who would be outnumbered. Ayana opened the door and called out in Lakota, her voice carrying clearly through the still afternoon air. The wolf calls stopped immediately, replaced by the sound of men moving through the forest with purpose. Samuel could hear branches breaking and leaves rustling as the invisible circle around his cabin tightened. Ayana called out again, longer this time, and Samuel caught his own name in the mixture of unfamiliar words. She was explaining the situation, he hoped, telling them that he had helped rather than harmed her. The response came from multiple directions, angry male voices demanding answers, getting closer with each exchange. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear enough. They were furious, and they wanted explanations. "They want to see me," Ayana translated, her face tense with worry. "They want to know why I stay with White Man instead of coming home." Before Samuel could respond, the first warrior emerged from the tree line. He was tall and lean, with long black hair and paint streaking his face in patterns Samuel didn't recognize. A rifle was cradled in his arms, not quite pointed at the cabin, but ready to be raised in an instant. Then another warrior appeared, and another, until Samuel counted 6 men arranged in a loose semicircle around his property. They were all young, all armed, and all looking like they wanted nothing more than to put bullets in the White Man who had somehow spirited away their missing tribal member. The largest of the warriors, a man who could only be Matto based on his bear-like build and fierce expression, stepped forward and spoke rapidly to Ayana. Even without understanding the language, Samuel could tell it was a combination of relief, anger, and demand for immediate answers. Ayana responded calmly but firmly, gesturing to her splinted leg, and then to Samuel. She was telling her story, explaining what had happened, but Samuel could see that her brother wasn't entirely convinced. Matto's dark eyes kept flicking between his sister and the White Man who had taken her into his home, and those eyes held nothing but suspicion and barely contained rage. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, and Samuel realized with growing dread that this confrontation was far from over. As darkness approached, the stakes would only get higher, and the margin for misunderstandings, potentially fatal ones, would grow dangerously thin. Chapter 5. When torches light the darkness. The standoff stretched on as the sun disappeared behind the western mountains, leaving the clearing bathed in the purple twilight of early evening. Samuel remained in his doorway, hands visible and empty, while Ayana continued her patient explanation to her increasingly agitated brother. The other warriors maintained their positions around the cabin, silent as shadows but unmistakably present. Matto's responses grew sharper and more demanding. At one point, he gestured angrily towards Samuel, clearly questioning why his sister was defending a White Man. Ayana's voice remained steady, but Samuel could see the strain in her posture as she balanced on her injured leg, refusing to show weakness in front of the warriors. "What is he saying?" Samuel asked quietly during a brief pause in the heated exchange. "He says, 'You take me to make trouble for our people,'" Ayana translated, her voice tight with exhaustion. "He thinks maybe you hurt me, then pretend to help, or maybe you keep me to trade for something." Samuel's jaw clenched. He understood the logic, even if it stung. In Matto's position, with the history between their peoples, he would probably assume the worst as well. Trust was a luxury that had been beaten out of most frontier relationships through years of broken promises and bloodshed. "Tell him he can search the cabin," Samuel offered. "Tell him he can see that you've been cared for, not harmed." As Ayana relayed this offer, Matto's expression shifted slightly. He spoke briefly to the warrior nearest him, then stepped forward with deliberate slowness. His rifle remained ready, but not quite aimed as he approached the cabin door. Samuel stepped aside, keeping his hands visible as Matto entered. The big warrior's eyes swept the small interior, taking in the bed where Ayana had been recovering, the medicine supplies Samuel had gathered, the simple meal preparations. His gaze lingered on Samuel's rifle, propped against the far wall, and clearly unused. Matto picked up one of the makeshift splints Samuel had fashioned, examining it closely. He spoke to Ayana in their native language, and she responded with what sounded like technical details. Samuel realized she was explaining the medical care she'd received, the skill with which her leg had been set and bound. For the first time since arriving, Matto's expression showed something other than anger or suspicion. He looked directly at Samuel and spoke a few words in heavily accented English. "You know medicine?" "A little," Samuel replied carefully. "Men get hurt in the woods. Sometimes the doctor is too far away." Matto nodded slowly, understanding the reality of frontier life. He examined Ayana's splint more closely, testing its stability with gentle pressure. Even Samuel could see that the warrior knew something about treating injuries, probably from battlefield experience. The examination seemed to satisfy Matto that his sister had indeed been cared for rather than harmed, but when he emerged from the cabin, his expression was still troubled. He spoke rapidly to Ayana, gesturing toward the surrounding forest. "He says we must go now," Ayana translated. "Before full darkness. It is not safe for our people to be so close to white settlements at night. Others might come." Samuel understood. A war party near Bear Creek after dark would be seen as a raiding force, regardless of their actual intentions. If word reached the town, armed settlers might ride out, and the situation could escalate beyond anyone's control. "But you can't travel yet," Samuel protested, looking at Ayana's injured leg. "It's too soon. You could do permanent damage." Ayana translated his concern, and Mato's response was sharp and dismissive. Samuel didn't need a translation to understand that the warrior wasn't interested in a white man's medical opinions, but Ayana surprised everyone by responding firmly to her brother, her voice carrying an authority that made the other warriors straighten. She was clearly arguing with Mato, and from his increasingly frustrated expression, she was winning. The argument continued for several minutes, with other warriors occasionally offering input. Samuel stood helplessly, understanding that his fate, and possibly Ayana's, was being decided in a language he couldn't follow. Finally, Mato threw up his hands in obvious exasperation and stalked away from the group. "What's happening?" Samuel asked. "I tell them I cannot travel tonight," Ayana explained. "My leg, it needs more time. And I tell them that you are good man, that you save Ayana's life when you could have left her to die." Mato returned, having apparently composed himself, and spoke more calmly to his sister. The conversation that followed seemed more like negotiation than argument, with both sides making points and considering options. "He says, if we stay tonight, the warriors will watch," Ayana translated, "to make sure you do not harm me, and to protect from other whites who might come. Is this acceptable to you?" Samuel looked around at the 6 armed warriors positioned around his property. The idea of spending the night surrounded by men who still didn't trust him wasn't appealing, but he understood their position, and truthfully, he was more concerned about Ayana's well-being than his own comfort. "Tell him yes," Samuel said. "Tell him I understand why they need to watch." As darkness settled over the clearing, something remarkable happened. One by one, the warriors lit torches, not the aggressive brandishing of weapons, but the practical illumination of a temporary camp. The flickering light created a circle around Samuel's cabin, transforming what could have been a menacing siege into something that looked almost protective. Mato positioned himself closest to the cabin door, clearly taking personal responsibility for his sister's safety. But as the evening progressed, Samuel noticed that the warriors' attention seemed divided between watching for external threats and observing the white man who had helped his family. Samuel brought blankets outside for the warriors, along with coffee and what food he could spare. It wasn't much, but it was a gesture of hospitality that seemed to be understood and appreciated. One of the younger warriors even attempted a few words of English, trying to thank him for the coffee. Around midnight, when the air had grown cold enough to see their breath, Mato approached the cabin again. This time his manner was less confrontational and more curious. "You live alone?" he observed in his careful English. "Yes," Samuel replied, "for many years now." "Why?" "White men usually travel in groups, build towns." Samuel considered how to explain his self-imposed exile. "I lost my family. Sickness took them. I came here to find peace." Mato studied his face in the flickering torchlight. "Ayana says you have sadness like her. What sadness does she carry?" It was Ayana who answered, speaking softly from where she sat in the doorway. "I was to be married. Good man, strong warrior. He died fighting soldiers last spring. I have no children, no husband, only grandmother and brother now." The shared understanding of loss created a moment of connection between the 3 of them. Samuel saw his own grief reflected in their faces, the universal pain of surviving when loved ones didn't. In that moment, the barriers of language and culture seemed less important than the simple human experience of mourning. "I'm sorry," Samuel said to both of them, "for all of us who've lost too much." Mato nodded slowly. "War makes many sorrows. Maybe too many." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the torches burn lower around the clearing. The other warriors had settled into their watch positions, alert but no longer openly hostile. The night sounds of the Montana wilderness, owls calling, branches creaking in the wind, the distant howl of real wolves, created a natural symphony around them. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with pale pink light. Decisions had to be made. Ayana's leg was better, but still far from healed. The warriors needed to return to their people before their absence caused alarm. And Samuel faced the question of what would happen next in his carefully ordered solitary life. It was Ayana who proposed the solution. Speaking first to her brother in Lakota, then translating for Samuel, she outlined a plan that surprised everyone. "I will stay 2 more days," she announced, "to let Leg heal properly. Mato will take other warriors home. Tell grandmother that Ayana is safe. Then he returns with travois to carry me if needed." Mato's initial reaction was predictably negative, but Ayana pressed her argument with the same quiet authority she'd shown the night before. Samuel watched the exchange with growing respect for her diplomatic skills and her obvious intelligence. "She's right," Samuel added when the argument paused. 2 more days will make the difference between healing properly and being crippled. I give you my word that she'll be safe." Mato turned to study Samuel's face, perhaps trying to judge whether a white man's word meant anything. Finally, he spoke directly to Samuel in English. "If harm comes to my sister, I will find you. No matter where you go, no matter how far, I will find you." "I understand," Samuel replied, "and I accept that responsibility." With the decision made, the warriors began preparing for their departure. The torches were extinguished as the morning light grew stronger, but their circle of protection had served its purpose. Trust had been established, tentative and fragile, but real. As Mato prepared to leave, he paused beside Samuel. "You are strange, white man," he said thoughtfully. "Most would not risk danger for Sioux woman." "Maybe," Samuel replied, "but most haven't learned that loneliness is worse than danger." Mato considered this wisdom, then nodded once before joining his warriors for the journey home. As they disappeared into the forest, Samuel and Ayana stood together in the morning light, both of them changed by the night's events. 2 days later, when Mato returned with a travois and an elderly woman Samuel assumed was their grandmother, the old medicine woman examined not only Ayana's healing leg, but also Samuel himself. Her dark eyes seemed to see far more than his physical appearance, and when she spoke to Ayana, her words carried the weight of long experience and deeper understanding. "Grandmother says you have healing heart," Ayana translated with a smile. "She says maybe the spirits brought us together for reasons we do not yet understand." As Samuel watched the small party disappear down the trail toward their distant village, he realized that his years of solitude were coming to an end. Not because he was leaving his mountain refuge, but because he had remembered something he'd forgotten in his grief. That healing, whether of bodies or spirits, was something best shared with others. The lonely lumberjack would remain in his forest cabin, but he would no longer be alone. The torches that had surrounded his home at midnight had illuminated more than the darkness. They had shown him a path back to human connection, built on the simple foundation of one person helping another in their time of need. Winter was coming to Montana, but for the first time in 8 years, Samuel Hayes found himself looking forward to spring.